everybody, this is Jason Augustus Newcomb, and we are inside the Magic Circle once again. Today I'm talking to Sorita d'Este, and she is the author of many books and the publisher of Avalonia, and a magical teacher of great reputation and great repute. This is one of the interviews that I'm most excited about in a while. I've been trying to get her to talk to me since December, but we've just been back and forth, and it's finally happening. So welcome, Sorita.
Thank you, Jason. I'm sorry it took me so long.
No worries. It took me a long time too. I mean, we're just scheduling and various people assisting me and stopping assisting me and so forth has just made it.
But thank you for your patience and persistence.
Finally, we get to talk. So, so let's start at the beginning. You have had a very magical life. How did that path open up for you? At what age did you know that you were going on a magical path, and how did you get here?
Well, that's an interesting question. It's a different way of asking the question, because mostly people say, where did it start? At which age I knew, I guess only really in my 20s, when I was already on that path formally for quite some time, did I realize that I couldn't really escape doing this, and it was something that was really important to me. But for me, it started with as for many people, with childhood experiences of psychism, out-of-body experiences, and a kind of interest in things that other people didn't take an interest in, such as dreams and mythology, folklore. And I guess I've just always been more inquisitive. So, it started from that. But even though my formal introduction to witchcraft came when I was a teenager, and I continued to experiment with things after that when I moved to London, I guess it's only in my mid-20s that I really realised that there was no escaping my interest and my connection to the occult, and what I thought was just possibly a phase I was going through was really both my religion and what I wanted to dedicate my life to.
When you were a child and dreaming, was there a particular dream that either recurred or marked you in some way? I have a few of those in my life, and I like it. I love dreams.
Yeah, so I have one in particular that recurred a lot, which is a little bit hard to explain, but it was a dream that I first remember when I was literally a toddler still. I was 3-4 years old the first time I remember having it, and it recurred pretty much every year, again and again, usually around my birthday, which was, in a nutshell, of flying and then falling. And when I fell, it was like a snowball effect of rolling and trying to escape something. I mean, there's more to it than that, but that is the dream that caused me to, start looking into things as a child and reading all the occult books in the libraries I could find where I was living. But in South Africa, mostly the occult and metaphysical section was what not to do, how to avoid the dangerous world of the occult. So I went about reverse engineering quite a lot of things.
What you mentioned mythology too. Was it always sort of the Greco-Roman mythology that was interesting to you, or were there other things as well? Because I imagine in South Africa you're exposed to more worlds.
Yeah, definitely. So in South Africa, where I was growing up, I guess all the stories we got told as children were based in either the kind of grim fairy tales, as it is in Europe, but also a lot of local stories, because I grew up in a predominantly Afrikaans-speaking neighborhood, and I went to a first language school that was Afrikaans, and there was a lot of stories kind of drawn by Afrikaans speakers from the Bushmen, or the Khoikhoi, as they're called now, the San people of the Kalahari, but who were indigenous to that region of Africa. And they've got some fantastic stories about grasshoppers being kind of creatures talking, and the praying mantis is a god, and it's really interesting stories about all the kind of interactions of the animals and stuff. But then also, I guess, growing up in a country that was a little bit more old-fashioned in many ways, because it was so cut off from Europe and the kind of roots of the people that I grew up with, because I grew up there during the apartheid regime, of course. a lot of the kind of folkloric stories and superstitions of the Europeans that came there, you know, the Dutch, the French, and then also kind of Greek and Italian people, Portuguese people, survived, and people would still tell those stories or have those little beliefs or superstitions. And I guess I always just had a little bit more of an interest in them, and I took a lot of them very seriously as a child, to the dismay of my parents, I'm sure. So, you know, a lot of that. And, you know, as a teenager, I started learning the Xhosa language, which is one of the indigenous languages. And as part of that, I got to spend time around some of the Xhosa tribe people in the more rural settings where there are shangomas, which are the healers as well. But they wouldn't talk to me because I was a white girl, teenager. Sure. Obviously shouldn't be, you know, kind of involved in these things during that time. But I always observed, it was always a kind of fascination of mine. But I moved to London when I was 20, 21, having already kind of done some work with a formal witchcraft group in South Africa. But, you know, it's only really in London, I think, that I realised just the scope of material that was available, discovering places like Watkins Books, Atlantis Bookshop, and just spending all the spare money I had. I wasn't earning a lot of money back then, but you know, spending it like we all do on buying books and going to events and trying to learn from as many people as I could. So, you know, it's an interesting journey, really, and you know, lots of ups and downs, I guess, on the way, but not one that I regret, actually.
Hopefully not.
Not yet. Not yet.
I'm sure we all have regrets about some things, but hopefully not the whole journey itself. And it. So you mentioned that you felt like you couldn't get off. Are there times when you sort of have wished, oh, I wish I could just sort of go be normal and stop this stuff?
I think I still have those moments sometimes.
Sure.
But luckily, I live on a hill in one of the most bonkers towns in England. Definitely weird and strange in the place I live in is a place called Glastonbury, famous for its abbey and its tor.
Sure.
And people come here from all kinds of different religious groups and for all kinds of different reasons. And, you know, frankly, I feel very, very normal here, because some of the beliefs here are far stranger and far more out there than mine. So it's a good place to be like that.
And so, I mean, that's it's featured in the book, The Mists of Avalon, as sort of like being actually Avalon. And is that a common sort of folk belief about that, or was that sort of originated in that book?
No, so the idea that Glastonbury is Avalon has been around since the monks, during a time of extreme financial pressure, about 500, 600 years ago. They needed money to fix some work on their abbey after a fire, and then doing the work when they were really struggling to gain the finances for it, they just happened to find, you know, in inverted commas, because nobody really knows for sure, the so-called grave of King Arthur and Guinevere.
Yes.
And of course, King Arthur was mythically buried on the Isle of Avalon. So ever since then, Glastonbury has been Avalon in the minds of many people, in the minds of many story writers. And if you come to the town, you know, the welcome to Glastonbury sign actually says welcome to the ancient Isle of Avalon on it. So
interesting.
It's a very popular theme and belief that people hold here.
I do remember hearing about that story now, that they did find supposedly King Arthur's grave. And why do you doubt that as an occultist? You're supposed to believe everything that is mystical.
I think the King Arthur story is most likely a composite story of lots of different heroes, mixed with that of kings that obviously did great things during the so-called Dark Ages. But I think the convenience of when it was found and the lack of evidence that links it to King Arthur at this point, or the lack of evidence that a King Arthur even existed, would make it very unlikely. Plus, there's so many places around Britain and also in France that claims to be the Isle of Avalon, or to be, you know, this mythical island of priestesses of Morgan Le Fay and Vivian of the Lake, etc. But the landscape here does lend itself to this story, because where I'm sitting in my office, I'm looking out onto the Somerset Levels, which is at sea level. And sometimes if we've got a clear sky, I'm just looking, but it's definitely too cloudy today. When we've got a clear sky, you can sometimes see the sun reflecting in the water, because the sea is just over there, but nowhere near us, but it is over there. But the land is so flat that you can see all the way there, because this used to all be marshland that was drained by the priest to create more grazing and more agricultural land. So still floods, and this would have been an island, so it kind of fits with that story. And I think whatever the historical basis for it is, and or lack thereof, Glastonbury's become a special place, and maybe it was a special place before that.
True.
Because before that, there's a rumor that it was the first place that there was a chapel to the Virgin Mary outside of Rome. There's a story here that Joseph Arimathea came here with the young Jesus, the kind of so-called missing years, that he traveled here as a trader. So there's a lot of mythology, there's a lot of stories in the landscape, and the people that come here today continue to kind of create stories, and some of those stories may well be around for another 100 or 500 years, who knows.
So I grew up in Massachusetts, and there we have Salem, which is a famous, really more for a terrible incident than a mystical thing, and yet it has become sort of a haven for modern occultists in a lot of ways, and there's tons of shops there and all that sort of stuff. And down here in Florida, I used to live in Orlando, and just outside of Orlando, there's a place called Casadega, which has a bunch of, it was a spiritualist community in the first part of the 20th century, and it has become, again, another place where there's tons of psychics and new age shops and stuff in that spot. Does Glastonbury have that feeling to it, or is it different than that?
Yeah, it's definitely, it's actually a very, very small town. There's only 9,000, 10,000 people that live here. So it's not that many people really in the greater scheme of things, but the high street is mostly crystal shops, yoga equipment shops,
Gotcha.
health food shops, witchy shops.
Okay.
So it's definitely a theme here. So it's a tiny town, but it's definitely a theme here. And people come here either for the shopping, or they come here for the sacred wells. We've got the Chalice Well, which is the red spring, and then the white spring, and the waters flow out next to each other, which is interesting. And people believe them to have all kinds of healing powers. Some people believe that the red spring is red because the chalice from the Last Supper was put in there, or the chalice from Jesus' crucifixion was put in there, and hence is, the blood. Other people believe that it's the god and goddess, and mixing on the landscape. So it's very famous for that. It's very famous for its mount, which is called the Tor, which has got an old church tower on it that was dedicated to St. Michael, which again has got a lot of occult significance for people that are into things like ley lines. The Michael and Mary line passes through here, both very significant in that world. So there's a lot of things here, and there's also a very strong connection to Dion Fortune, whose work was, of course, very influential. She lived and worked here for some of the time, and she's buried here. So, a lot of people kind of come here for that connection. They've read
it seems like every occultist needs to make a pilgrimage. So
yeah, it's definitely an interesting place. I've never been to Salem. I think Salem is a much larger place from what I know.
No, not really. It's not. I mean, the city itself may be large, but there's sort of like a downtown that's fairly small, and but it is very packed with occult shops there. So you do a lot of teaching. Do you do local teaching there? Is that a good? Does Glastonbury lend itself to getting a lot of students to be interested in coming to courses and stuff? Or?
No, so I have only recently returned to teaching. I took a long hiatus from it. For about 10 years, I never formally taught, other than doing lectures at events and stuff over the last 5 years. But I took a very deliberate break from teaching. In the early noughties in London, I ran a lot of groups and courses, and I taught a lot of people. But for about 10 years, I stopped taking on students other than in a very small private group, and when invited to do so for other groups. But now I am returning to it. I've kind of made a promise that I would do to a few people. And I feel it's important to do that, because when you teach, you learn as much from your students as they hopefully learn from you through the questions and the interactions and stuff. And I feel it's a really important part of my journey going forward.
I agree. Teaching is a great way of learning, because people ask you questions that you've never thought about, or you've never thought about things in that way. So, so you were in your 20s and you moved to London, is that correct? And then at some point you became oh, sorry, go ahead. I think we have a little bit of a delay going.
No, that's right.
So how did you move from student to teacher and writer? What was that journey?
So in the 90s, when I moved to London, I worked in health foods, and during that time, I had a partner who was a musician, and I remember going to Tower Records in London, which is like a really famous record store in Piccadilly Circus at the time. And in the basement, they had a section selling magazines and all sorts, really. And I found a copy there of a pagan magazine with advertising in for an event. And I was quite surprised, because I didn't realize at that time, I'd been in London for 2 years, deeply immersed in the kind of health food world, the alternative remedies world, and deeply immersed at the same time into jazz and popular music and all kinds of other things. And I was kind of, this is at the beginning of the days of the internet and stuff, and we didn't all have internet at home yet. So it was before you could kind of reach out and just find out anything you wanted. And it never occurred to me that there would be entire shops dedicated to the occult and entire conferences and groups out there. So it was a very pleasant surprise to, find some advertising in there for shops. And I kind of started going and buying all these books and learning about the kind of things that I didn't know about, very much on my own steam. And then in the late 90s, I bumped into various events via astrologer friends and stuff that I had at the time. Kind of met a lot of pagans, met a lot of the old school London occult people that was around at the time. And I feel very blessed to have known some of them, because sometimes you learn so much from just sitting down and talking to people, and you don't realize or appreciate it very much until years and years later. I find, you sometimes it's more special than you realize. But then in 2000, I met somebody called David Rankin, who's well known now for his work on the Key of Solomon and the Goetia, other grimoires with Stephen Skinner, of course. And David and I started working together. We started a training circle for initiatory witchcraft, but kind of with a lot more ceremonial magic in it, I guess, than the average group had at that time. And we explored all kinds of things together for many years. We wrote several books together. And that's how I started teaching, really, is through initiatory witchcraft. And then being invited to speak on particular topics, and just kind of learning more and more as I went along. And I was very lucky to have had a couple of fantastic mentors who were both very, very private people, but both people that were involved in the kind of early initiatory witchcraft movement in the 60s and 70s. That really helped me a lot, just by encouraging me and pointing me in the right direction, lending me the book I needed to kind of fill the gap in my knowledge. And I guess I just dedicated myself completely to it. I just threw myself into trying to learn and debate and experiment. A lot of magical experiments went on and still goes on every now and then. When I bump into something, I think, I don't know what this is. This sounds really interesting, or it sounds really bad. I'm going to try it and see what happens. So I've always been into doing that a lot. And then 13, 14 years ago, I had my son, and he's severely disabled, so I don't generally talk about that very much in public, but people that follow me on Facebook knows, because I took him on quite an epic journey a few years ago. and I had to take time out. So I focused a lot more on things that I could do from home that didn't involve
Sure.
me having to travel, etc., because I needed to be home for him. And, in that time, I focused primarily on developing my catalogue with Avalonia. But again, that's such an amazing opportunity to learn from all the authors I get to work with,
Yeah.
both in working with their material, but also in kind of private discussions and clarifying things as you go along. You learn so much by working, or I learn a lot from working with other people in that way. So I've been focusing a lot on that. In that time, I've also done a degree course in religious studies because I thought it would be fun, just to kind of pull me into that kind of world a little bit and kind of explore religion from a different
Mhm.
perspective. So, I've done a lot, but in the last few years, I've been able to start traveling a little bit again and going to conferences and groups around the world to talk about the subjects that matter to me. And I am going to be returning now to more formal teaching again,
Well,
which
that's
feels good.
wonderful to hear. Yeah.
It's
So,
daunting, but it feels good.
at what point did you decide to start a publishing concern? Because you've got quite a large catalog of books that you've published at this point.
Yeah. So that was slightly by accident, to be perfectly honest.
Most good
I've
things
learned,
are.
I didn't sit down one day and go, oh, I know, I'm going to change careers. What happened was in about 2004-5, I thought it would be very fun to write some very specific little books on topics that interested me. And I've not actually done that. That never
Like these
came to
ones?
be. But
Is this what you're talking about?
no, it wasn't those originally at all. No, much more specific. And I approached a few publishers about it, and they were like, no, it's too niche. Too niche. Why don't you write us a 101 book on Wicca? And
Mm,
I was like, there's enough books that cover Wicca 101. I'm sure somebody can do a really good job of another 101 book, but it's not going to be me. At that time, it was those coffee table books with lots and lots of pretty pictures that were very, very popular, and what my friend calls the covered books, which has like velvet covers and they look all mystical and whatnot. And it just wasn't for me. So I was doing a lot of freelance writing, and I had a proper career in the West End, but I decided to just publish kind of things in note form, really. The first book I put out was a book that I co-authored with David on the Irish Celtic goddess, the Morrigan,
hmm
who's the goddess of war and sovereignty and all this kind of stuff. And we didn't even edit it very properly because it was like, I think we both thought like 20, 30 people would be interested in it. And we're kind of just doing it to make it available to some of our friends. And, to my surprise, I continued doing that. And then a couple of people asked me to publish their books. And it was all very small and low key in those first years. But I guess after the birth of my son and moving to Glastonbury, I thought, well, actually, I've got all this material. I might as well turn this into my livelihood,
Sure.
because I think it's great to be able to do something you love and spend your time with that. And I've just been really, really blessed to work with incredible authors. I'm not the most high profile esoteric publishing company out there. I don't do a lot of limited editions or,
hmm
just grimoire things. I do all kinds of things, mythology, history, and then of course some practical books like the ones I did with David that you held up. Um, the practical magic books that we did. I guess it was just a way of making available material that we had that we were no longer going to use, but we thought might be useful to other people.
So are you saying that a lot of the things you publish were things to sort of like exit them from your life, or?
Not exit it. It's kind of like, I think with the practical elemental and Kabbalah, and there's also one
Yeah.
on the planet, it was material that we kind of put together in a course form,
Mhm.
for a group that we were teaching in London. And we were doing that for several years, and then we moved out of London, and I kind of said, well, this material is just going to sit around for years and nobody's going to be able to benefit from it. And you know, some of the people we were working with at the time were like, can we have this in printed form? Can you send me a PDF?
Gotcha.
So we were like, well, we might as well just put it out there. And again, you know, it wasn't meant to be the start of something that it's become. But, you know, that seems to be the story of my life. I seem to walk into things kind of quite accidentally, quite blind, like a fool.
Yeah.
That's just being led, you know, let's go this way, let's go that way, and things just seem to work out.
I know
But
the
if it,
feeling. So you've written a number of books about Hecate.
I,
What does Hecate mean to you in your life? Like, what is her role?
yeah, so Hecate is a goddess that I bumped into in witchcraft, but of course originally in the work of Shakespeare and myth
Hmm.
and stuff as well. But in a ritual context in witchcraft, she was introduced to me. And the way that she was introduced in witchcraft and also in the Fellowship of Isis that I was involved with when I was younger for a while was very much as the kind of crone goddess,
Hmm.
the goddess of witchcraft, you know, all these kinds of things. But I remember being asked to sit in ritual as an oracle, which was a common thing in one of the groups that I was in at the time, and to essentially channel Hecate when I knew very little about her at the time. And I just remembered that the experience, the lady that was doing the invocation was very experienced. And I just remember the experience of that as being very different from anything else that I've experienced at that time. And I did a lot of work, you know, psychic work and energy work and spirit work and Solomonic work and things. But the energy was much more tangible in a strange way, and the whole experience stuck with me. And as a result of that, I started researching her more and more and more. And I also noticed that in the group I was co-facilitating, the teaching group that I was running with David Rankin, people's experiences with Hecate tended to be more transformative than their experiences with other deities, because we were quite a polytheistic group,
Hmm.
where we were, you know, exploring all kinds of things. You know, there was
Sure.
archangels, there was typical
Pantheon of the
West.
month, right? I was
Yeah,
involved in a group like
exactly.
that.
And you know, people brought all kinds of things with them to the group and wanted to, you know, share that sometimes. So um, I guess I just kind of noticed that the experiences people had with her was a lot stronger. And I picked up a couple of books, read them, and thought the stuff I'm reading about her is so different from how she was introduced to
Hmm.
me in witchcraft.
Yeah.
You know, I read Higgity Sorita by Sarah Alice Johnson, and also a book called The Goddess Hecate by Stephen Ronan.
Hmm.
Both of them are focused on the Chaldean Hecate,
Right.
which is much more similar to the Neoplatonic idea, you know, where Hecate is like the soul, the membrane, and, you know, she's right there in the hierarchy as a kind of source of souls, the source of virtues. Is a very different picture from the kind of gothic, dark, crone-like creature in a cave that, you know, dances with ghosts and, I don't know, scares people, as it were. So I guess that intrigued me even more. I was like, no, well, how did we go from here to here? You know,
Sure.
what happened? And that caused me to just dig deeper and deeper and deeper. And at that time, I guess my main interest was magic and using magic to change things and to achieve results. But you know, things changed, and I got more and more drawn to Gnosticism and theology and all kinds of different strands of magic that really took me quite far away from initiatory witchcraft, which has very different views of the world and a much more relaxed theology, I guess,
Mm.
than you know, starting to kind of enter into system with the theology, and the beliefs were a lot more fixed. And you know, as time went on, that was just what, you know, kind of held me there, is the experience of it, the effectiveness of working with the magic of Hecate, and being a servant to her in many ways, and trying to share the information that I've gathered over the years, because I feel that it needs to be out there to counter the kind of negative image she's been given, quite unfairly, really, because a lot of that comes from early Christian writers during the kind of late period of paganism, early period of Christianity, where, of course, there was a reason to kind of demonize, if you like, the pagan gods that had bigger cults or stronghold in any particular area or region. So I guess I just felt like a need, like nearly a calling to start sharing things. Not that I saw it like that at the time. It was more like I was infused with some crazy, you've got to get this right, you know, can we stop talking nonsense? But, you know, that doesn't always work. So I was very lucky to just be in a position where in 2010 I put a project together. This is after the publication of Hecate Liminal Rites, which came out in 2009. And Hecate Liminal Rites brought together, David and I brought together all kind of tidbits of magical things, and we tried not to kind of duplicate what was already in the books on Hecate Sorita and the goddess Hecate that I mentioned. We tried to just focus on, you know, those magical things and kind of gather them together.
Yeah, it's almost a like a source book of Hecate lore and stuff that, you know, it just has a bunch of different. It's an interesting book, definitely worth having.
We always tried in the history type books that we did together. We tried to keep out too much clutter, you know, of our own opinions and other people's opinions, just sticking to the things that we actually know and that we could gather. And a year later, I put together an anthology called Hecate, A Sacred Fires, which is a very large book. I haven't got one on my desk.
I don't have one right here either.
It's a very large book, and it brings together several dozen people's experiences and visions of Hecate.
Yeah, it's very beautiful and artistic as well.
Yeah, there's all kinds of amazing things in there, and just reading people's experiences as I went through that was very, very touching, because even though the majority of those people come from traditions that I have no contact with, the majority of those people at the time I'd never met, it was a catalyst for many things. You know, that project in some ways was very important, even though it isn't the book I'm necessarily known for. It was a book that caused things to happen, like connections between people to come together, friendships, different groups. I created the Rite of the Sacred Fires for that, and then that became a yearly thing. Then I created the Covenant of Hecate with a few people, and again that brought people together. So it's been a very interesting ride with her, and I don't think it's anywhere near finished. You know, there's a lot of very exciting things happening in the Hecate world. I'm joking, actually. In recent years, it seems like she's become a goddess of literature. There's so many books being written about her.
She's definitely grown and changed in the minds of occultists. When I was first, you know, sort of coming up in occultism, she was part of sort of a triplicity in which she was called the crone in a lot of traditions, and in the tradition that I was trained in, that was what she was. And that seemed odd to me at the time, because there were other stories of her being, you know, the magical goddess that was inspiring. In at least one of those, she's called a maiden, which doesn't, you know. So I mean, it never really quite added up. And it's interesting that you've been a big part of it, transforming into a more full view. So, but what does she mean to you personally in your own spiritual life? Like, where does she fall in? Is she the creator god for you? Where does she live in your spirit?
That's a really interesting question, really. For me, she is primarily the soul of the world, the kind of axis mundi, if you like, the ensouling part of nature. I would say the kind of tangible energy of the world. So not quite the earth itself, but the thing that keeps heaven and earth apart. And you know, people often ask me how I see her. You know, do I see her in her triple form or a single form, or? And I don't really see her as a goddess that necessarily have to have that human form that we so argue about so much. I feel she's far more than that. She is for me the goddess of the Chaldean oracles. She is the source of souls, the source of virtues. You know, I really do believe that those things are more important for me in relation to her. So for me, she is the kind of, I guess, the mother of the gods and the goddess that, I don't know, is more important to me than others. Although I am very much a polytheist as well, so it's not like I don't believe in the other gods.
Mm-hmm. But
Um,
so does she sort of, is she above and controlling all of the sort of more cosmic gods, so to speak, the ones that
does she
are?
control? I don't know whether she controls them or not, because for me, I
I
guess
shouldn't say,
my,
I shouldn't say control. I mean, is in charge of them, is their superior in the hierarchy for you?
well, in the theogony, it says that the deathless gods, in other words, the other gods,
Mm-hmm.
um, honor Hecate. They essentially offer honors to her. They offer worship to her, which seems a bit strange. And I guess I understand that to mean that she's a goddess that's older and that she earns the respect even of the gods. And if she earns the respect of the gods, then I feel that she obviously earns my worship or my devotion, as well, because I've named myself as somebody who is a devotee of her.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel, you know, for me, she's central to my universe, but it doesn't mean that she's central to everybody's universe. And, you know, I'm reluctant to kind of define her like that. But I do have a belief that's very similar to the idea expressed in the Chaldean oracles, with the kind of three realms and with Hecate having a role in all of them. Again, like she does in the theogony, but in the theogony it's expressed as heaven, the starry heavens, the earth, and the ocean. Whereas in the Chaldean oracles, it's more the kind of world above, where, you know, the world of spirit and the source of things, the world of spirits and the world of man, if you like. And but obviously more complicated than that. It's a whole huge big subject that would take a long time to explain in detail for people that are unfamiliar with it. But for me, she is that. She's the source of all things. She's the soul of the world. Um, she's that liminal space between heaven and earth and life and death, always kind of there between things, connecting things. So she's completely central to my own devotional work. Although I do honor other gods as well. I also have, you know, strong relationships with gods such as Hermes and Dionysos, um, Apollo, you know, many other gods.
But she is more central than they are, or more at the core of
She's at the,
things.
she's definitely at the center of my worship, you know. But it wouldn't be fair for me to say she should be at the center of everybody's worship.
Right, but I mean, everybody's just, those are other people. I'm talking about you.
So for me, she's definitely at the center of my worship.
And so you know, one thing I've noticed, that a lot of the people who've been around for a long time, their practices seem to have gotten more compact and more inner and less sort of formalized. Is that true of you as well, or do you have a devoted temple space in your life, or?
Yeah, we've got two spaces in my home that are dedicated to temple life.
Mm-hmm.
The primary kind of one where I share space with other people during this lockdown year has become a multi-use room a little bit because of my son being home a lot. But I'm very lucky to have a space in my garden as well, like a little secret room where I've got, for my magical practice and my devotional practice, set aside. And you know, that is a space specifically set up for Hecate, and it's where my devotional practices to her are focused. But I think spaces are, it's kind of interesting, because I think if you asked me this 10 years ago, then my temple space would have been, you know, all around a double cube altar and,
Mm-hmm.
you know, shiny blades and things. And those things are still there, and they're still very, very important to me. And I think formal ritual is very, very important. But I also think that, you know, like you say, things have become simpler, and I think devotion has become a bigger part of my own story than, you know, swinging swords and daggers around. But I'm very fond of formal ritual, and I think formal ritual has an important place in teaching us how to simplify things, because without being able to learn the reasons why things are done, we don't know what we should be, you know, drawing on. And I see a lot of that right now in the world of magic and witchcraft, where people are simplifying things because experienced occultists are saying we can simplify things, you don't need this, you don't need that.
Hmm.
But then if you have no experience, it's a little bit like telling people to do what feels right, which is a very popular thing in pagan and witchcraft circles. You know, just maybe just do whatever feels right.
Right.
And
Well, I mean, to me, it seems a little bit like telling people to just pick up an instrument and make sounds, you know, instead of learning to play it.
it just doesn't work like that. You know, it's like, I think some people obviously have the skill to just pick up an instrument and play it and do it well, but it's a very small minority of people for which that's going to be true. The vast majority of musicians spend hours, days, weeks, years mastering the skills that they need. And I think the same is true in magic. So I know when it's necessary to pick up the formal tools, but I only know that because of having done it. And I know what I can change. And even sometimes when I know what I want to change, or what I think I want to change, I will still refer back to sources and check that I'm not making a mistake in my understanding.
Sure.
Because sometimes removing, you know, I guess music is a good analogy that you've brought into it. But, you know, if you have a guitar but you take the strings away,
It's
you're
not
not
an
going to
instrument.
have an instrument, right?
You can use it as a drum still, but
If you use a drum, you can still make a sound on it, but it's not its intended use. Um, if you've got a guitar and it's tuned in a different key, as long as you are masterful enough, you can work with that. Even if you're incapable of retuning it, you can still play in a different key or something. But if it doesn't have strings, or, you know, I don't know, all the pegs, is it called pegs, that you adjust it with? If all of that's broken, or, you know, whatever, you kind of just can't do what you need to do. So the more knowledge you have, the more experience you kind of gain through practice and work and making mistakes, a lot of mistakes, I think you are more capable of knowing what you can change. You know, you can change this guitar for that guitar,
sure.
because sometimes, you know, one thing is better than another. um, and maybe you learn you don't want to play guitar, you want to play the piano, or you want to play the flute. So I think that's how you learn. You learn through doing, not through just kind of looking at something and deciding to change it. So yes, my practice has simplified, but sometimes I can still get very complicated.
One of the things that that has become more popular, along with Hecate, is the Greek magical papyri, which has seemed to be
Yeah.
enjoying a renaissance right now. They've been something that I've been studying for 20 years or so, but
Hmm.
but it seems like it's becoming more interesting to people. Do they play a part in the ritual that you do still, or
Yeah.
have they played? I noticed that the gods you reference, a lot of them are pretty important in the Greek magical
The
papyri.
different
So,
Pokemon cards, yes. So I guess through my study of Hecate, but also working with David Rankin, and, you know, the work he did with Stephen Skinner, and the work he did in the kind of grimoire world and stuff. For me, the Greek magical papyri was already something I picked up in the 90s before I knew David, but I was like, I could see some of the parallels. You know, there's some little similarities between some of the things in the Greek magical papyri and some of the things that you find in the grimoire traditions. And that kind of intrigued me because I did a lot of Solomonic work, but, you know, way back when it was all Mavis and Crowley,
mm-hmm.
Solomonic work, and then kind of later rectified that a lot with the Veritable Key of Solomon and the work Joseph Peterson put in as well, and, you know, people like Aaron Leach and stuff, just kind of learning from their material. But Yeah, the Greek magic of papyri is intriguing because it's a whole mishmash of things, which some of the grimoires can be as well.
Yeah.
You know, the grimoires is not just the formal ritual; they're quite often bound up with books of secrets, which can, I mean, the Veritable Key is a good example of that because it had a whole section that Avalonia published separately as the collection of magical secrets. I had to think on that for a moment, which is the material that Skinner and Dave and Rankin didn't include in the Veritable Key because it was just not Solomonic material. But it
Right.
includes some very bizarre remedies, you know, holding a peppercorn in your mouth while you're making love to a woman is supposed to stop the woman from getting pregnant, and crushing up, I think it's an earthworm, I might be remembering this wrong, but crushing up an earthworm with olive oil and putting it in your hair to stop your hair from going grey. You know, so some really bizarre things that you just would not associate with, you know, things like the Key of
Solomon.
Solomon
Yeah.
or the grimoire tradition in general. You'd think of it more as, you know, superficial and superstitious folk remedies or something. Um, so you know, the kind of PGM is very much like that, as I'm sure you know. There's some things in it that is just a bit, you know, but there's
Outlandish.
a lot of very, very good material in there. There's a lot of rituals in there, like the Prayer to Selene, that I've adapted because it's very clearly that is as a ritual to Hecate,
Hmm.
and it can be adjusted. And when you learn the patterns and the forms of the spells, you know, they follow a kind of formula that you can adjust and use for other things. And I rarely go back to the kind of, you know, proper PGA material now because over the years I've adjusted and worked with some of the things that interest me the most. Um, so and I've also been very lucky over lockdown to work on Christopher Plassans' book called Evocating the Gods, which is about evocation in the PGM. So that's kind of opened up some new ideas and things for me as well, which I want to work with more as soon as this lockdown finally finishes. Please. So you know, there's a lot of really good stuff in the PGM.
So I want to wrap things up pretty soon, but I just have a couple more areas I just want to kind of pick your brain about, and that is in terms of doing magical work and spiritual work in general. What part do you visions and the visionary state play in that? I know you mentioned dreams were very important to you early on in your life, so
Mhm.
and that you felt sort of guided by Hecate towards Hecate. So what form does that take in your work?
So for many years, that took the form of, I guess one would say, ritual possession, you know, a chance work with the gods
Hmm?
in a group context, but in a very controlled group context with, you know, tests being in place, etc., for, you know, testing the validity of the questions and keeping a record of the results from that. So in that sense, you know, trance possession, trance work. Oracular work. And then a lot of my work over the years has also been focused on black mirror work,
Hmm.
so scrying and inducing dream visions. I think that dreams are and has always been a really important kind of augury of and method for the gods or spirits to communicate with us. So that does play a role. And in evocation, you know, I've got other things that I use that I expect to happen or that I expect to see results in when I do that kind of work, which is more rare these days. But, you know, when I do that, I do want to see a vision, or I want to have a very clear indication that what I'm doing is actually on the right path. So I think visions are very, very important, and but also things like auguries and omens.
You mean things that happen outside of the ritual space later, or
Yeah, things that happen outside, kind of learning the you know, something I call it the language of the gods. I think Joseph Campbell calls it symbolic language. And I think we're talking about the same thing, which is that all the gods have and spirits have a language that they communicate in, which is very different from, you know, English or Spanish or Portuguese or something. It's not a spoken language. that for Hecate, for example, because we're talking about her, would include the very obvious symbols that she's associated with, the triple form, the single form, but also torches,
Mm.
light, lamps, the daggers, the snakes, the offering bowls that she's shown with, the polos that she's shown with on her head, the kind of different headdresses as well, the modius. So I think sometimes when we engaged in magical or spiritual work with deities and spirits, we do need to learn as much as we can about them so that we can recognize their symbols and their kind of messages or guidance in the everyday world. It's not necessarily always an apparition that's going to come to you, but I also don't mean to go, completely. I know some people that get into gematria or something will start, calculating the number of every single thing they encounter and sitting referencing it and stuff. I don't mean that, and I also don't mean every time you see something that you necessarily assume that it's the god or spirit communicating with you, because sometimes a snake is just a snake, and sometimes a candlelight is just a candlelight. It doesn't necessarily mean something, but to kind of learn to recognize when
Mm-hmm.
there's symbols coming together and when it's in a different context. So recognizing and being able to discern the difference between a mundane encounter and something more, something that can be read as an augury or an omen or some kind of form of guidance from the gods, but without seeing it everywhere, because I think that's also not very helpful or healthy.
So when you do a ritual to talk to a spirit or a god, do you expect them to communicate back with you during the ritual, or do you just allow it to be whatever happens and then look for signs later?
No, if I do a ritual, specific ritual to evocate, I expect there to be communication during the ritual.
And what form does that usually take?
If the ritual works, because of course some things don't always work, it can take the form of a vision. So, seeing something within the medium of choice, whether that's water, black mirror, smoke. I'm not so fond of smoke sometimes because I think it's open to interpretation, but smoke and fire, flames and stuff like that, whatever the medium is, a crystal, or having a kind of, I guess, an auditory, I can't speak English tonight, an audible experience where you actually hear something.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I think that needs to be something that we can test. I'm very keen on testing things and ruling out my own imagination or, a coincidence and stuff like that, because I think it's important. I think it's really important that we have, those kinds of things in place. I'm not very popular for having those kinds of things in place and having strong visions on strong ideas on that, because of course we don't want to be told that that vision we thought we just had might not be true. But I think if you want to kind of foster a stronger connection with the spirit, or you want to be able to extract information from that spirit that is meaningful, you do have to have a way of testing it, in the same way that you'd be able to test it if you did a spell for something. Did it work? If you did a ritual for something, did it work? Did an amulet protect you? You can only know if it worked when you've got the results of it.
Sure.
So I feel very strongly about testing visions, testing ritual results.
And do you mean during the vision, or do you mean afterwards, seeing how it all kind of hangs together and as things move forward?
Both.
I know
Absolutely both.
the Golden Dawn liked to have people, do the grade signs to the spirits and to test them.
Yeah.
What would your testing method be?
Um, my testing methods depend on what I've evoked. I'm not going to show them any grade sign, because I think I'm not convinced that that's going to do any good. But I'm sure maybe within the context of a Golden Dawn temple, it does some
In a
kind of
Golden
good.
Dawn temple, perhaps it seems a little odd in general to assume that any entity would know what the Golden Dawn grade symbols were. Why?
Yeah. So or if by now they didn't all know it.
Sure, yeah. I mean, why? Yeah, why? It's been published, so it's not.
I think entities should be given the credit for being able to learn things. If we're calling on entities because we want to learn something from them,
Mm.
I think we either need to be willing to be subservient to that entity in a devotional context, or in I guess a pact type context. I'll do this for you if you do this for me. Or we need to be willing to control the powers and the spirits that we evoke, because otherwise we are not in control of our own magic, are we? So I think, depending on the situation, I think there's questions you can ask. There's little tests that you can set up depending on what it is that you evoke. But again, I think being able to learn the language of the different types of entities that you work with is probably the best way, rather than asking the entity, "Are you really Jason?" Knowing what you look like, or which number you're calling from, or there's all kinds of ways that I can check your ID in this day and age. I mean, we've got passports and ID cards and things like that as humans, and I think if we learn the language of the spirits or the gods that we evoke, then we are more capable and more likely to be able to master the ability to discern whether there's something right or wrong about what's standing in front of us.
It seems like, particularly at the beginning, though, it's a bit of a hard task to ask, because things come in different levels of clarity and look different at different times, and so, I mean, things transform through the course of a vision, and so I mean, it seems like it's a particularly for someone just getting started. Is there any sort of, like, I don't know, key that you can give to the
Yeah, I would say if you're just getting started, and again, it's not the thing that people want to know always, but the foundations are important. So just like, I don't know, learning the piano or guitar, going back to that, is learning which key it's in, learning which key or string represents which notes, how things harmonize, kind of learning the language of magic and the magic that you're trying to do. Because today a lot of people are self-taught, because there's so many websites, so many courses, so many books. And I think there's this allure to try and jump in with the kind of conjurations and the kind of more complicated rituals, or the more, I don't know, interesting rituals, as somebody starting out might encounter it. But I think if you learn the basics, there's importance in learning the basics. So take your time would be the advice I give, and just learn the basics, and learn the basics of different systems. That's so much easier today than it was even 20 years ago. To just read up a little bit about the Golden Dawn and the OTO and Wicca and witchcraft, and this tradition and that tradition. There's so many traditions now.
What does the basics mean to you, though? Like, what would you say? What would you say a beginner should jump in with?
Okay, so for me, in the Western mystery tradition, it would be having read up about all the key pantheons, everything from Norse, Greek, Roman, Celtic, etc. Kind of having a base knowledge of the Egyptian, pantheons, because you're going to bump into those names on a regular basis. And I think it's important that we have our own ability to discern what we're encountering and whether or not it rings true with the knowledge that we've already got. And also to have knowledge of all the key magical traditions that started in the late 1800s, early 20th century, 19th, 20th century, having a kind of base knowledge of all the planets and their correspondences, the symbols associated with them, the colors associated with them, having a base knowledge of the elements, the 4 elements in particular, air, fire, water, earth. There's so much of that permeates the Western traditions, whether it's Greek or Wicca, you're going to find the 4 elements in it. Having a basic
Even
knowledge
Tantra,
of,
or
it just appears there in all kinds of forms. So having that base knowledge allows you to again have a level to start your discernment from, and being able to understand what you're reading, and whether it's where you want to go, rather than just believing what you encounter. A base knowledge of the Kabbalah, base knowledge of Hermetics. So it's a lot of reading and a lot of kind of, interacting with people and trying to just establish a little bit of everything, especially correspondences, I think, because it just allows you to understand what it is that you're encountering. Because magic, I mean, if we talked about the PGM, and there's so many things in there, I used one particular phrase from it, which is based on the Ephesian letters in the Rite of Her Sacred Fires 10-11 years ago, because it was something I used in my rituals on a regular basis, aske, kataske, etc. And people always ask me, this is a Greek phrase, what does it mean? But of course, it's voces magicae, it's barbarous words, it's a very ancient thing. And if you encounter that, you can misunderstand it so easily, and people start, interpreting it and stuff. So I think just having a good base knowledge of the occult world, the tarot as well. I'm not particularly fond of the tarot myself, but I think it's important to have like a good basic knowledge of the tarot, with the Rider-Waite or the Thoth deck. Or
okay, I'm curious. So you don't like the tarot? I just want to know what that's about.
I can go on.
I hate it when I interrupt, but I'm going to.
No. I think just having a kind of good knowledge of all those basic things, for me, that's just really, really important.
What don't you like about the tarot? I'm just curious.
Oh, okay. I think that as a little girl, my grandmother didn't like the tarot. And I think somehow that installed a dislike or suspicion in me and the tarot. I do work with the tarot, but I specifically only work with the Rider-Waite or the Thoth, because the symbolism in it is classical symbolism. I guess I'm a bit old-fashioned as well. I don't know. I'm just not very fond of it.
Okay.
Have I just committed to heresy? Have I just committed to heresy?
No, not at all. I've been talking to a lot of people who don't like the Kabbalah anymore, and people who don't, they don't like astrology, particularly modern astrology. So I mean, there's a lot of, everyone's got different flavors of things that they like and that they don't like. But beyond reading and study, what's a practice that you would recommend to people in terms of who are just
starting out? So I think starting out, definitely kind of creating your kind of energy body work, kind of learning how to, separate fact from fantasy. So kind of working on your energy body and just keeping your energy in a very controlled way, and being able to control your moods, your feelings, etc. So, one of those classic things of a kind of psychic shield, or there's many different practices like that. Meditation would be a good practice as well. Or if you're drawn more to, working with the gods, then probably a devotional practice, setting up a shrine in your home and doing a daily practice.